A quiet law with loud consequences. It did not dominate headlines or spark immediate outrage. It passed through committees, amendments, and signatures with little public attention. Yet this single law reshaped American banking more profoundly than many crises ever did. To understand why this law still matters today, we need to revisit a moment when stability seemed secure and reform felt technical. The economy was growing. Markets were calm. Lawmakers believed the system needed refinement, not restraint. The goal was efficiency, clarity, and modernization, not transformation. The law addressed narrow issues on paper. It adjusted definitions. It updated permissions. It resolved edge cases that regulators and institutions had debated for years. Supporters framed it as housekeeping, necessary cleanup for a complex financial system that had outgrown older rules. What made the change powerful was not what it restricted, but what it allowed. Activities once limited became permissible under new interpretations. Institutions gained flexibility to expand services, merge functions, and operate across boundaries that had previously slowed them down. Each allowance felt reasonable. Together, they rewired incentives. Banks responded quickly. Structures adapted to take advantage of new freedoms. Business lines expanded into adjacent areas. Revenue models shifted toward activities the law now encouraged. Risk migrated, not outward, but inward, embedding itself deeper into everyday operations. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The system absorbed the change smoothly. Profits rose. Competition increased. Consumers saw more options, faster services, and greater access. The law appeared to deliver exactly what it promised. But laws do more than permit action. They signal intent. They shape what institutions believe is acceptable, safe, and encouraged. This quiet law told banks that expansion was no longer a warning sign. It was a virtue. And once that signal was received, the system began changing in ways no one had fully mapped. Because the most consequential rules are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that quietly redefine what normal looks like. As the law settled into practice, its influence spread beyond the letter of the text. Regulators adjusted interpretations. Courts deferred updated definitions. What began as a legal clarification became an operational shift across the industry. Boundaries that once slowed decision-making faded into technicalities. Institutions reorganized around the new environment. Compliance teams reframed constraints as opportunities. Products were redesigned to fit within expanded permissions. Activities that once required separation now operated side by side. Risk did not spike suddenly. It blended, becoming harder to isolate and easier to overlook. Competition accelerated the process. Firms that moved aggressively gained advantage. Those that hesitated felt pressure to follow or fall behind. The law did not force expansion, but it rewarded it. Growth became the rational response, even for institutions that valued caution. Markets reinforced the signal. Investors rewarded scale, diversification, and complexity. Larger institutions were seen as more stable, not because they took less risk, but because they operated under a framework that now endorsed their reach. Confidence followed size. Size followed permission. Oversight struggled to adapt. Supervision still relied on structures designed for clearer separation. Examinations focused on compliance rather than interaction. As long as activities were permitted, their combined effect received less scrutiny. Risk accumulated legally, but quietly. Public awareness remained low. Services improved. Credit flowed. Banking felt modern and responsive. Few noticed that the law had not simply updated rules. It had changed expectations. What banks believed they should do began shifting alongside what they were allowed to do. This was the deeper consequence. The law reshaped behavior without ever mandating it. It altered incentives without announcing danger. Stability seemed intact because nothing broke immediately. The system adjusted smoothly, efficiently, and confidently. Yet beneath that adjustment, complexity thickened, interdependence deepened, and the distance between legal permission and systemic understanding widened. The law had done its work, not through disruption, but through normalization. And once a new normal takes hold, it becomes difficult to question what it replaced. The conflict emerged when the system began reacting to stress in ways the law had never anticipated. Pressure appeared not in prohibited activities, but in the interactions between newly permitted ones. Losses surfaced where responsibility was shared. Risk moved across divisions too quickly to contain. Institutions discovered that flexibility had a hidden cost. When activities overlapped, problems did too. A disruption in one area affected others almost immediately. What once could have been isolated now spread internally, amplified by scale and speed. The law had removed friction, but friction had also been a buffer. Risk management frameworks struggled to adapt. Models still evaluated exposures in parts, while reality behaved as a whole. Assumptions about independence failed. Correlations rose. Stress traveled along legal pathways that oversight had not been designed to monitor collectively. Markets sensed the tension. Confidence wavered not because the law had been violated, but because its consequences were difficult to interpret. Investors questioned transparency. Prices moved on uncertainty rather than information. Volatility reflected confusion more than fear. Regulators faced a dilemma. The system was operating exactly as allowed. Intervention risked undermining the very clarity the law had aimed to create. Yet, waiting meant accepting a structure that could transmit stress faster than controls could respond. Authority met legality, and legality limited action. Public attention focused on visible events, not structural causes. Losses were framed as mismanagement or bad luck. The deeper pattern remained obscured. The law itself was rarely questioned, because it had not failed in an obvious way. This was the critical moment. The system had become vulnerable not through violation, but through permission. Stability depended increasingly on confidence that complexity could be managed, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The conflict was no longer about whether the law was right or wrong. It was about whether a framework designed to modernize banking had unintentionally accelerated its fragility. And once risk is embedded legally, removing it becomes far more difficult than preventing it in the first place. The reckoning arrived quietly, through adjustment rather than reversal. Policymakers did not repeal the law outright. Instead, they layered new rules on top of it, attempting to restore balance without undoing the structure it had created. Complexity increased further, as safeguards were added to manage consequences rather than eliminate causes. Institutions adapted once more. Risk controls tightened. Reporting expanded. Compliance costs rose. Yet the underlying permissions remained. The system learned to operate within the law's framework while absorbing its risks as a permanent feature. Stability returned, but it depended increasingly on oversight and coordination rather than simplicity. Markets recalibrated expectations. Confidence became conditional. Scale still mattered, but transparency gained value. Investors learned to price uncertainty created by complexity, even if they could not fully map it. The system did not retreat. It adjusted, carrying forward the legacy of the quiet law. For regulators, the lesson was sobering. Legal clarity does not equal systemic clarity. Rules that resolve narrow issues can reshape behavior far beyond their scope. Once incentives change, they are difficult to reverse without disruption. Law becomes architecture, shaping how risk flows. Looking back, the law's most powerful effect was not any single permission, but the signal it sent about acceptable behavior. It normalized expansion. It reframed caution as inefficiency, and it encouraged institutions to grow into the space it created. The enduring lesson is not that law should resist change. It is that every legal adjustment carries behavioral consequences that extend beyond intention. Stability is not preserved by updating rules alone, but by understanding how those rules reshape incentives over time. Because the loudest consequences often come from the quietest decisions. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.